Welcome to Infocom. I am Tigran Grigoryan, and today my guest is Daniel Treisman, who is a professor of political science at the University of California, Los Angeles. He is currently also the co-director of UCLA's Center for European and Russian Studies. Professor Treisman, thank you for accepting our invitation. My first question is related to one of your recent academic articles entitled How Great is the Current Danger to Democracy? Assessing the Risk with Historical Data, where you argue that economic development, economic growth, and long democratic experience are associated with much lower odds of democratic breakdown. You also add that based on VDAM's classifications, no democracy has ever failed at a per capita income above about $26,000 or after surviving for more than 43 years. However, in this article, you mainly focus on liberal democracies, and Armenia is not a liberal democracy. The same VDAM Institute classified Armenia in 2022 as an electoral democracy, and Armenia naturally doesn't have a per capita income of $26,000 and doesn't have a history of democratic survival. So, what would be your piece of advice to these newly emerging electoral democracies like Armenia in their process of democratic consolidation?
Well, I think, first of all, the way that countries consolidate democracy is not entirely clear. What we do know from the data is that over time, countries that remain democratic do become less likely to fail as democracies. So we see this not just in measures of democracy as a whole, but with measures of the different subcomponents of democracy, such as free and fair elections, free press, and so on. So countries that are in the first 20 years, and sometimes longer than that, of democracy tend to be vulnerable. And it's really very common to have some reversion and often then again return to a more democratic state. But after 20 or 30 years have passed, it's much rarer to see breakdown of democracy. The other aspect of this is that in the past, in much of the 20th century, the major cases of breakdown of democracy were complete breakdowns of democracy. There were military coups or sometimes revolutions in which the regime was overthrown, and all aspects or most aspects of democracy were removed all at once. What we've seen more often in the last 20, 30 years is what's commonly referred to as backsliding, when a democracy erodes gradually, the quality of the democracy decreases. Of course, no democracy is absolutely perfect. All have flaws, but leaders sometimes come to power who accentuate the flaws, who use the imperfections of the pre-existing system to consolidate their power and to reduce checks and balances on the executive, and also to control all other parts of society that previously had played a constraining role in the democracy, such as free press, civil society, various other social institutions. So what Armenia faces is the quite common situation of a country that has had a short period of democracy, but not long enough to consolidate. And as you mentioned, the other aspect of this is level of economic development. Countries at a very high level of economic development are less likely to revert to authoritarianism than countries at a lower level of economic development. That doesn't mean that there are no rich autocracies. There are, but they fall into two groups. Above a certain income level, roughly $25,000 to $30,000 per year per capita GDP. These two groups consist of, first of all, states that have enormous oil wealth, the states of the Arabian Gulf, certain other major oil producers, which managed to remain autocratic despite being very rich. And you could say, well, that's an exception to the rule. But in fact, when you look more closely, many of those countries don't really have the other elements of economic development, at least not initially, such as very high rates of higher education, urbanization, development of civil society and media, and so on. So their level of economic development is kind of a hybrid of high income and low socioeconomic advances, or at least delayed socioeconomic development. So that's one group of rich autocracies, and the other group of rich autocracies has only one member, and that's Singapore. Singapore is extremely wealthy, and it remains authoritarian. It's established a model that I think many authoritarian leaders around the world want to emulate, but none have really succeeded, because it's a very sophisticated model in which very little violence or overt repression is needed, but the political sphere is managed very systematically and quite completely to prevent any threats to the ruling PAP party from undermining the system that essentially Lee Kuan Yew developed in earlier decades.
Yeah, you described this system really well in your famous book called Spin Dictators, The Changing Face of Tyranny in the 21st Century, co-authored with Sergei Guriev. And before that, you were calling these systems informational autocracies. Some of the things you write about in the book are observable in countries like Armenia. The difference probably is that we still have some sort of free and fair elections, and the previous regime we had before the 2018 Velvet Revolution is probably closer to your definition of spin dictatorship. However, in recent years, and especially in recent months, we have witnessed more active efforts and measures implemented by the government to instrumentalize law enforcement and the judicial system for domestic political purposes. And there is this big debate within Armenia's civil society where parts of it are turning a blind eye on the government's actions because they consider the actors that are being targeted as anti-democratic and pro-Russian. And there are other parts of civil society that are truly concerned with these processes, thinking that these illegal anti-constitutional measures will eventually harm Armenia's prospects of democratic consolidations. In the book, you single out these active groups of informed citizens as the driving force of resistance against spin dictatorships. So what would be your assessment of the situation that I have just described, and what would be your pieces of advice for the Armenian society?
Well, yes, that's very much what we write in the book. The hope is that groups of informed citizens can resist the attempts by the executive to increase its power. And of course, all skilled executives that want to increase their power will find innocent-sounding pretexts, genuine dangers perhaps, that they claim to be combating with their assertion of new powers. So it's always a challenge to clearly distinguish measures that are taken to deal with genuine emergencies or genuine threats from those that are simply opportunistic efforts by the leader in power to weaken opposition and remove constraints on that actor, on the executive. What can people in Armenia who are concerned about growing power of the executive do? I think that's where modernization and higher levels of education come in. People with higher education, with international experience and international connections, with usually jobs in the information economy, people who are very familiar with information technologies and media, can organize to resist expansions of executive power. And I think that's why we see perhaps people who would like to be spin dictators in democratic societies only getting so far and being stopped ultimately by concerted efforts of the different elements of civil society, lawyers, courts, local government, academics and universities, journalists, free media, and so on. So I would say advice to Armenia, if you feel that the government is subtly changing the system into a more authoritarian form, organize, publicize, and coordinate actions to increase the coalition of people who are concerned about this and who are expressing that concern in peaceful but massive ways.
Yeah, the thing with Armenia is that it has traditionally had a very strong civil society. The reason why the 2018 Velvet Revolution happened was the existence of this strong civil society. However, after the revolution, parts of the civil society actually became part of the government. Parts of the civil society have sympathies towards the government and are afraid of the comeback of the previous regimes. And this conversation is a very relevant one at this point, because these anti-democratic actions by the incumbent are often rationalized by the existence of external threats, like hybrid threats. And some of our colleagues talk about the need to understand the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is Russia trying to interfere in Armenia's domestic affairs. So how would you describe the balance between countering these external hybrid threats and also upholding democratic norms and practices?
It's a huge challenge in many of these situations, many of these countries with young democracies or troubled democracies, like Armenia, because when there's an external threat, and a genuine external threat, that really has two consequences, which complicate the situation for consolidation of democracy. So the first effect is that it tends to rally the public, to unite the public against the external threat. And that can be very positive if that united energy backs a democratic movement or a democratic government. On the other hand, the emergency can be used to justify various measures that seem perhaps necessary at the time or effective as a way of reducing vulnerability to external threat, but that over time strengthen the executive relative to other parts of the government and relative to society in ways that undermine democracy. So there's always that tension between uniting the public, perhaps in a very helpful way, and justifying excessive executive power. And I think there are no blanket or blueprints, no general solutions to that. It's part of the battle of building democracy and keeping democracy. As always, the opposition movement, or the movement for preserving democracy, has to be sophisticated and make distinctions and fight using the legal system to, in some cases, make sure that these emergency measures are temporary, have a clear expiration date, and in other cases, just to resist what are actually unnecessary extensions of executive power. But it's difficult to do that in the political environment of a looming crisis.
Yeah, exactly. These are the conversations we are having now within Armenia. But continuing with Russia's topic, you present, in Spin Dictators, you present Russia as this example of a spin dictatorship. But would you say that after the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it has become more of a traditional autocracy?
Yeah, absolutely. So we think that Sergei Guriev, my co-author, and I think that Russia under the early Putin, especially 2000 to 2008, was a classic spin dictatorship. It used and actually developed some of the techniques that we see around the world in other spin dictatorships. Gradually after 2012, when Putin returned to the Kremlin, and much more clearly from about 2018 on, and absolutely after the second invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the regime reverted to what we call fear dictatorship. There's no longer any attempt to conceal the fact that opposition to the government is treated very harshly. There are really large-scale draconian laws about criticizing the army, which can result in sentences of 15 years, large-scale detentions and imprisonments of people who oppose the government and oppose the war, and a general imposition of very much tighter controls, including this year on the internet. So we see that as really reverting to the model in which the goal is not to persuade the general public that the regime is democratic, benevolent, modern, like all other successful democratic governments around the world, but rather to spread fear, to make people anxious, to make it very clear that loyalty is required and that people who are disloyal will be punished. So to deter any opposition rather than to genuinely persuade people through manipulation of information and through various other techniques that the regime is actually working for them.
Yeah, and I understand this is a very difficult question, but is there a trajectory in Russia that leads to a more open society, or are they all the options, bad options that will preserve the current system or even deteriorate it?
Well, so we can't predict the future, and that's just completely clear. What we can do is we can try to understand the past, and we can try to see the patterns in the past. So rather than speculating about a trajectory that would lead from the present situation to greater democracy in Russia, I mean, of course, if Putin were no longer there, things would change in some way. But rather than speculating about the precise trajectory, it makes sense to just look at the global patterns. And when we do that, what we see is that there's been a very clear long-run increase in the share of states around the world that have become democratic, whether electoral democracies or liberal democracies. And so that's increased dramatically over the last 125 years, along with increasing levels of economic development. But we also see cycles. These are often referred to as waves of democracy. And we see those waves at the macro level. We see around the world increases in the democratic impetus and then reversion, reductions. People have talked about a current democratic recession or even depression. And I think sometimes people have exaggerated the extent to which the share of democracies in the world has decreased. But nevertheless, we're clearly in an age of where the wind is behind autocracy rather than behind democracy. But so we see these cycles, and at some point, if the future resembles the past, we're going to get out of that down part of the cycle, and we're going to return to the global long-term trend of gradual increase in the share of democracies in the world. There's no guarantee that the pattern will continue, but if it does, that's what we'll see. And I think within that framework, it's not unreasonable to expect that Russia, which has a highly educated society, a very modern society in many ways, to expect Russia to evolve, or maybe more radically to jump to a more open, free form of political organization. But of course, as I started by saying, it's impossible to put a date on that and predict with any confidence when that will happen.
Yeah, and my last question is about the Russian attitude towards its neighborhood. You study both democratic development, and you also specialize on Russia studies. So there is this view that the current Russian leadership is not fond of democratic or emerging democratic regimes in its neighborhood. So would you agree with that assumption? And what do you think will be Russia's policy towards these more liberal, more democratic societies that are emerging in its neighborhood if and when the war in Ukraine ends?
Yeah, I think we need to distinguish Putin and the current regime and Russian society more broadly. Russian society more broadly, if you look at the opinion polls before Crimea and before the 2022 invasion, we don't see a lot of desire for aggressive expansion on the part of Russia. And we don't see a lot of desire to see authoritarian states surrounding all around Russia's borders. We actually see a kind of disappointed yet still hopeful attitude towards the West. Russian public opinion has tended to turn against the West at moments of tension, like the Iraq War, the Georgia War, before that, the bombing of Serbia over Kosovo. But in previous cases, it's rebounded. And I think, so if we were to characterize Russian public opinion over time, I would say it's fluid, and clearly Russian public opinion during the war has rallied towards the position of Putin and towards the narratives of Russian victimization and the need for friendly regimes near Russia. But that's not unexpected in a wartime situation when there's extreme propaganda on the main mass media channels. So I'm not sure that there's anything in Russian public opinion that's inconsistent with a peaceful, modern, even pro-democratic approach to the neighborhood. Obviously, Putin's regime is something else. And although he started, I think, much less committed to these kind of bizarre views of the course of history in which terrible injustices were committed in the Middle Ages and in the Soviet period, and now need to be dealt with in a military way. That narrative was really not that clear at all in the early Putin years. Now it's come to dominate. And so, and also the people around Putin and the regime these days are very extreme, aggressive nationalists rather than the mix of people that he started with. So at this point, Putin and his Kremlin circle seem absolutely committed to a policy that is hostile towards the West, that basically views Russia as at war with the West, whether it be hybrid war or perhaps at some point overt, kinetic war. So I think under the current regime, there's very little chance of an acceptance by the Kremlin of free democracies without Russian intelligence, secret service penetration, and manipulation around Russia's borders. But when this regime is no longer there, I think we'll see something else. And now that isn't to say that there aren't strong strains of resentful nationalism within Russia, within Russian society. Of course, there are. But they're dominant now because of who's in the Kremlin. And I think if there were a different regime in power, it's quite likely that those strains would not dominate anymore, and a more pragmatic approach and a more accurate view of history perhaps would eventually prevail.
Yeah, Professor Treisman, thanks a lot for this great conversation and all the best.
Thank you.